I was standing by my apartment window, watching the last streaks of sunlight fade behind the skyline, when my phone buzzed with a notification that finally forced me to see the truth I'd been avoiding for years. It wasn't a missed call. It wasn't a bill reminder. It was a message in our family group chat from my younger sister, Savannah. An amazing wedding family only. Brianna, please don't come. For a second, I actually thought it was a joke. Some twisted attempt at humor. But then I saw what happened next. My mother reacted with a heart. My father added a thumbs up. No one defended me. No one asked why. No one said, "She's your sister." And just like that, I understood something that had been building quietly for years. I wasn't their daughter. I wasn't their sister. I was their solution. For the past 3 years, I'd been paying the mortgage on the house they lived in. I covered the property taxes. I handled emergency repairs. I wired money without being asked twice. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it was what family does. Meanwhile, Savannah filled her social media with designer bags, luxury spa days, and champagne brunches funded, directly or indirectly, by the overtime hours I worked as a cybersecurity engineer. I lived in a modest apartment and ate takeout between 80-hour work weeks. She curated a life of effortless glamour, and somehow, I was the one who didn't qualify as family. But the message banning me from her wedding wasn't the real betrayal. It was the confirmation. The final stamp on a pattern that began years ago, the day my mother slid mortgage papers across the kitchen table and told me signing them would secure our future. I signed because I believed sacrifice would buy belonging. I was wrong. So that night, staring at that glowing screen, something inside me shifted. If I wasn't family, then I was done being their safety net. I typed a calm reply. I congratulated her. I wished her the perfect wedding. Then I added 2 sentences that would unravel everything. And within minutes, my phone exploded with calls from the same people who had just agreed I didn't belong. What they didn't know was that banning me from the wedding was the smallest mistake they were about to make. Stay with me, because what I uncovered next wasn't just betrayal. It was a plan to destroy my life. My name is Brianna Sterling. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a cybersecurity engineer in Virginia. Most days, my job is about preventing breaches, spotting patterns, and stopping damage before it spreads. I'm trained to notice small anomalies before they become disasters. Ironically, the biggest breach in my life wasn't digital. It was personal. Tonight, I want to tell you a story about family, about what happens when love becomes transactional, when sacrifice turns into expectation, and when the person who holds everything together finally decides to let go. It started on an ordinary evening. I was standing by my apartment window, watching the slow river of headlights sliding through traffic below. I had just wrapped up another 14-hour day. My shoulders ached, my inbox was still full, and the leftover takeout container on my kitchen counter reminded me I hadn't properly cooked a meal in weeks. But I felt that quiet satisfaction that comes from being dependable, responsible, needed. Then my phone buzzed. It was a notification from our family group chat. Savannah, my younger sister, had sent a message. An amazing wedding family only. Brianna, please don't come. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misread it. I blinked. I reread the sentence 3 times, waiting for context to appear. A follow-up, a laughing emoji, something to soften it. Instead, I saw 2 reactions appear beneath her message. My mom added a red heart. My dad added a thumbs up. That was it. No correction, no defense, no, "Wait, that's your sister." Just silent agreement. I wish I could tell you I was shocked. I wasn't. I was clarified. You see, this didn't begin with that message. That text was only the visible crack in a foundation that had been quietly crumbling for years. For the past 3 years, I had been paying the mortgage on the house my parents lived in. I covered the property taxes. I wired money for roof repairs, plumbing emergencies, HVAC replacements. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it was what successful daughters do, what loving daughters do. Meanwhile, Savannah curated a life online that looked like a luxury brand campaign. Designer handbags, spa weekends, beach trips, champagne dinners. Her captions talked about manifesting abundance and soft living. What they didn't mention was that abundance often came from my overtime hours. I worked 80-hour weeks. I took on freelance security audits on the side. I skipped vacations. I lived in a modest apartment while funding a suburban house I barely visited. And somehow, I was the one who didn't qualify as family. Quit. The thing about being the responsible one is that people start assuming you're indestructible. My mother had a phrase she loved to use whenever I hesitated about another financial request. "You're strong, Brianna. You can handle it." Strength became the excuse. My success became the justification. Every promotion meant a larger expectation. I remember the day it really began, the day I signed the papers. I had just received my first major professional paycheck. I was 22, proud, hopeful. My mom sat me down at the kitchen table, with documents already neatly arranged. My credit score was the highest in the household, she explained. If I co-signed, the interest rate would be better. It was for our future, for stability, for the family. My dad sat quietly in the corner, staring into his coffee. He didn't object. He didn't encourage. He just stayed silent. I signed because I believed sacrifice would secure belonging. Looking back now, I realize I didn't sign just for a house. I signed for approval. Over time, something subtle shifted. Phone calls from home became shorter unless money was involved. Conversations about my stress were redirected toward Savannah's needs. If I mentioned rising utility bills or burnout, my mom would gently pivot. "Savannah has a big event coming up. She needs a new wardrobe." Or, "Your sister's mental health is fragile. She deserves comfort." Fragile. That word followed Savannah like a halo. Fragile meant she couldn't be pressured. Fragile meant she couldn't be criticized. Fragile meant I absorbed everything. The message banning me from her wedding wasn't the first time I felt invisible, but it was the first time it was explicit. Family only. I stood there in my quiet apartment, the city lights flickering against the glass, and let that phrase sink in. If I wasn't family, then what had I been all this time? An ATM? An insurance policy? A silent sponsor? The worst part wasn't even the exclusion, it was the ease with which it happened. No hesitation, no guilt, just public dismissal in a group chat I had financially sustained for years. My first instinct was to stay quiet, to swallow it, to tell myself it was wedding stress, temporary emotions. But then I imagined showing up anyway, smiling politely, while knowing I had funded the venue, the catering, maybe even the champagne they'd toast with. Something inside me hardened. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel hurt. I felt done. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could feel my pulse in my throat. But my message wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It was calm. I congratulated Savannah. I told her I hoped her wedding was everything she dreamed of. And then I added 2 sentences. "Since I'm not considered family, starting today the mortgage and property taxes are your responsibility. Also, I'll need my Tesla returned immediately." I pressed send. Within 2 minutes, the entire group chat disappeared. And my phone exploded. Call after call after call. My mother, my father, Savannah. Numbers I didn't recognize. Voicemails stacking up faster than I could process them. It was almost funny. For years, my presence had been optional. My money had not. Now that the money was optional, suddenly I mattered. I let the phone vibrate against the counter while I stood there in the dim light, listening to it buzz like an alarm I'd finally decided not to snooze. If you've ever been the dependable one, the fixer, the provider, the person everyone leans on without asking how you're standing, you might understand that moment. The moment when exhaustion transforms into clarity. I didn't know yet how far this would go. I didn't know that what I was about to uncover would go beyond entitlement and into something much darker. At that point, I thought this was about boundaries. I was wrong. Because banning me from the wedding wasn't the worst thing they had done. It was just the first mistake they made, after assuming I would never fight back. And if you think this story ends with a few angry phone calls and a cancelled RSVP, stay with me. Because what I discovered next didn't just threaten my relationship with my family. It threatened my entire future. After I sent that message in the group chat, my phone didn't stop ringing for almost an hour. I didn't answer. I just let it vibrate against the kitchen counter while I stood there, staring at the dark screen like it was some kind of mirror reflecting a version of me I barely recognized. Calm, detached, not crying, not apologizing, just finished. But if I'm honest, what I felt wasn't strength yet. It was adrenaline. The kind that surges through you when you finally say the thing you've rehearsed in your head for years. And as the calls kept coming, my mind drifted back to where all of this truly began. Not the wedding, not the Tesla, not even the mortgage payments. It began 10 years ago, on a summer afternoon that smelled like hot pavement and fresh ink. I had just landed my first serious job in cybersecurity. I was 22, still living at home, proud of myself in a quiet, cautious way. My paycheck wasn't massive, but it felt like independence. It felt like possibility. That afternoon, my mother called me into the kitchen. The blinds were half drawn, sunlight cutting across the table in bright strips. There was a neat stack of papers waiting for me. Legal documents, tabs, sticky notes. She smiled the way she does when she's about to ask for something she's already decided I'll give. "Sit down, Brianna," she said. "We need to talk about the house." And Kos. The rent on our old place had gone up again. My parents wanted to buy instead of rent. The problem, she explained gently, was credit. My dad's credit history was inconsistent. My mom's income wasn't stable, but mine was clean, strong, promising. "If you sign as the primary guarantor," she said, sliding the papers closer to me, "we'll qualify for a much better rate. It's just paperwork. It doesn't mean you're paying. It just means we're using your good standing to secure our future." Dated. Our future. She always knew how to phrase things so they sounded collective. I remember glancing at my dad. He was sitting at the end of the table with a mug of coffee, staring into it like he could find answers in the steam. He didn't object. He didn't reassure me either. He just stayed quiet. That silence should have warned me. But I didn't see a trap. I saw responsibility. I saw an opportunity to prove that I was reliable, capable, the daughter who could fix things. I signed. At the time, it felt like a milestone, like I was helping build something solid for all of us. I didn't realize I had just tied my financial future to decisions I wouldn't control. At first, everything seemed fine. The mortgage payments were manageable. My parents handled most of it. I focused on my job, growing my career, building savings. Savannah was in and out of small business ideas, boutique clothing, handmade candles, a short-lived event planning venture. My mother described each one as a learning experience. Whenever they failed, it wasn't her fault. It was timing. It was the market. It was bad partners. It was never her. As the years passed, subtle changes began. Small requests, temporary gaps. "Can you cover this month? Just until things stabilize. We had an unexpected repair. Could you help with half?" Savannah's business investment didn't pay off, but she's close to something big. Close to something big. That phrase became a kind of anthem in our house. Meanwhile, my career was actually growing. Promotions, certifications, long nights, longer weekends. Cybersecurity isn't glamorous, but it's intense. I worked with companies that trusted me to prevent financial disasters. I analyzed vulnerabilities for a living. It's almost embarrassing to admit that I didn't analyze my own. Within 3 years, the temporary help became permanent. The mortgage payments shifted slowly but surely toward me. Then the property taxes, then insurance premiums. My mother framed it as smart redistribution. "You're the highest earner now," she'd say gently. "It makes sense." Makes sense. Savannah, on the other hand, was living what she called her soft life. Her social media feeds were curated perfection: brunch tables, silk robes, rooftop cocktails. She talked about self-care like it was a full-time occupation. If anyone questioned her income, she'd smile and say she was supported. Supported. I was that support. But I didn't fully grasp the imbalance until I visited one weekend and saw my Tesla parked in the driveway, except I wasn't the one driving it. I had left the car there temporarily during a business trip, thinking it would be safe. When I walked up the driveway, I saw Savannah in the driver's seat, adjusting the mirrors like she'd just purchased it herself. She rolled down the window and laughed. "The leather isn't the beige I would have chosen," she said casually. "But it's still cute." Cute. I felt something shift in my chest. It wasn't just about the car. It was the entitlement in her voice. The assumption. When I asked my parents about it, my mother stepped between us like I had just threatened something fragile. "Your sister needs stability right now," she said. "She's going through a lot. You're strong. You don't need the car as much as she does." There it was again. Strength as justification. My dad stood nearby, nodding faintly, as if this all made logical sense, as if my ownership was a technicality. I went back to my apartment that Sunday with a quiet ache that felt heavier than anger. I told myself it wasn't worth making a scene. It was just a car, just money, just temporary. But over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. My phone rarely lit up unless there was a bill attached to it. My accomplishments were acknowledged briefly, then redirected towards Savannah's needs. When I tried to talk about burnout, my mother would gently remind me of how lucky I was to have such a stable career. "You should be grateful you can help," she'd say. "Not everyone gets to support their family like this." Support. That word used to feel warm. Gradually, it began to feel like a leash. And then came the wedding planning. Savannah's engagement was announced like a royal proclamation. Derek was described as ambitious, driven, full of potential. I noticed quickly that potential was the same word my mother had once used for Savannah's failed businesses. The venue they chose was extravagant, coastal, expensive. When I asked how they were managing it financially, Savannah laughed and said, "Things have a way of working out. They always did. Because I always made sure they did." The truth is, I didn't wake up one day furious. I woke up tired. Tired of being the quiet foundation everyone stood on. Tired of being praised for my resilience while being denied tenderness. Tired of being the backup plan for people who didn't see me as family unless I was paying. So when that message appeared, "An amazing wedding family only," it didn't create the fracture. It revealed it. It told me, in plain language, what my bank statements had been whispering for years. I wasn't their daughter. I was their guarantee. And the moment I understood that, something inside me began to change. Once I truly understood that I had become the guarantee instead of the daughter, I started noticing details I had trained myself to ignore. It was like adjusting the brightness on a screen and suddenly seeing all the smudges that had been there the whole time. The favoritism, the quiet expectations, the way every achievement of mine somehow translated into another obligation, it had always been there. I had just convinced myself it was normal. The more my career advanced, the more expensive their needs became. When I earned my first major promotion, my mother congratulated me warmly. She told relatives how proud she was that her eldest daughter worked in cybersecurity for major firms. But later that same evening, she gently asked if I could increase my monthly contribution just for a little while. The property taxes had gone up. Savannah was restructuring her latest business idea. It would stabilize soon. Soon became a permanent state. I found myself living in two completely different realities. In my professional world, I was respected. Clients trusted me with sensitive systems, complex networks, critical infrastructure. I led teams, solved breaches, prevented financial catastrophes for companies that would collapse without proper protection. I was decisive, analytical, calm under pressure. At home, I was the extension cord, plugged in, powering everything quietly in the background. My workdays stretched longer. 80-hour weeks weren't unusual. I took freelance consulting projects late into the night, telling myself I was building a safety cushion. The irony was painful. I was building one for them. My savings account never quite grew the way it should have, because every time it began to expand, something urgent happened at the house. A plumbing emergency, a roof leak, a tax adjustment, a car repair, a short-term loan to help Savannah bridge the gap. It's 7 times 40 and Savannah's gaps were endless. She had a way of presenting her financial disasters as temporary miscalculations. She wasn't reckless, she said, just visionary. When her boutique clothing line failed, it was because she had aimed too high. When her event planning business folded, it was because clients didn't appreciate quality. When she attempted a small cosmetics line that quietly disappeared after 6 months, it was because the market wasn't ready. The market was never ready. The bills always were. Meanwhile, her social media told a different story. Designer handbags arranged perfectly on hotel beds, champagne glasses raised against sunset backdrops, spa weekends captioned with phrases like "invest in your peace" and "living intentionally." I once stared at a photo of her dining at a high-end steakhouse while I was eating microwaved leftovers after a 14-hour shift. I knew the date of that dinner because the charge had hit my credit card earlier that day. She had borrowed it just for a week. A week turned into silence. I remember calling home one night, exhausted, just wanting to hear something that wasn't about money. I mentioned that my electricity bill had doubled due to winter heating. I laughed awkwardly, hoping for a little sympathy. My mother cut me off gently. "Savannah has a networking event this weekend. She needs a new dress. It's important for her future." Important for her future. My exhaustion, apparently, was not. That was when I began to understand the unspoken hierarchy in our family. Savannah was fragile. She needed protection, comfort, encouragement. I was strong. I could endure. The word strong sounded like praise, but it functioned like permission to give, to sacrifice, to absorb. If I hesitated, my mother's tone shifted subtly. "You don't want your sister to feel left behind, do you? You're the successful one. You can help." Success, in our household, wasn't something to celebrate. It was something to redistribute. The disparity grew sharper when Savannah moved back into the house after her third failed venture left her deep in debt. Instead of urging her to find stable employment, my mother welcomed her back like a returning hero. There was no lecture, no accountability, just reassurance. "She needs time to recover," my mother said. Recover from what? I wanted to ask. From spending money she didn't have? But I swallowed the question. When I visited that weekend and saw Savannah using my Tesla like it was her personal accessory, something inside me tightened. I had worked overtime for that car. I had researched it, saved for it, dreamed about it. It was one of the few tangible rewards I had allowed myself. Yet there she was, complaining that the leather interior wasn't her preferred shade of beige. When I confronted the situation calmly, my mother stepped between us, shielding Savannah physically and emotionally. "Your sister is under a lot of stress," she said. "She needs comfort right now. You're strong enough to manage without it." There it was again. Manage without it. Without what? Without rest? Without acknowledgement? Without ownership? My father stood nearby, nodding faintly, avoiding eye contact as usual. His silence was a constant presence in our home. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't loud. It was simply there, reinforcing whatever my mother decided. That night, I drove back to my apartment feeling hollow. Not furious, just diminished. Like I had been quietly erased and replaced by a role. Over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Weeks would pass without anyone checking in on me until the quarterly property tax reminder appeared. Then suddenly, my phone would light up with concern. "Just making sure you're okay. We didn't want to pressure you. We appreciate everything you do." Appreciation always arrived with an invoice. One evening during dinner at the house, I overheard my mother speaking to a neighbor in the hallway. She didn't know I was within earshot. "Savannah is the heart of this family," she said warmly. "Brianna keeps things running. She's the engine." The heart and the engine. It sounded poetic. It wasn't. An engine doesn't get celebrated. It gets used. That comment stung more than any financial loss. It confirmed what I had been feeling but hadn't wanted to articulate. My value wasn't emotional. It was functional. I was essential but not cherished. Every time I tried to express fatigue or suggest a break from covering certain expenses, guilt followed quickly. My mother would remind me of the roof over their heads, the stability I had helped create, the sacrifices parents make for their children. It was subtle. She never demanded outright. She framed everything as shared responsibility, shared love, shared duty. But the sharing only flowed in one direction. Savannah never once offered to pick up part-time work to contribute to the mortgage. She never suggested downsizing the wedding venue. She never acknowledged the imbalance. Why would she? The system worked perfectly for her. The more I gave, the more invisible I became. And yet, I kept giving. Part of me still believed that if I proved myself indispensable enough, they would finally see me as more than a resource. That someday, my mother would look at me with the same softness she reserved for Savannah. That my father would speak up, even once, and defend my boundaries. Instead, my promotions led to higher expectations. My resilience led to heavier burdens. My silence became their reassurance. By the time Savannah's wedding planning began in full force, the financial requests no longer came disguised as temporary support. They were assumed, integrated, calculated. I began to feel like a walking bank account with a pulse. And when that message banning me from the wedding arrived, it didn't just hurt because I was excluded. It hurt because it exposed the truth I had been funding for years. I wasn't part of the celebration. I was the sponsorship. And for the first time in a decade, I started to wonder what would happen if the engine simply stopped running. By the time Savannah moved back into the house after her third failed business venture, the imbalance in our family wasn't subtle anymore, it was structural. It had weight, it had routine, it had expectation woven into it so tightly that even questioning it felt like betrayal. She returned home dramatically, of course. A tearful phone call, a collapsing dream. Investors who didn't understand her vision. My mother spoke about it as if Savannah had survived something heroic rather than predictable. She tried, she kept saying. At least she tried. No one ever said that about me. Trying, in my case, was assumed. Achieving was required. Failing was not permitted. When I drove to the house that weekend to check on her, I didn't realize I was walking into the moment that would permanently shift something inside me. I pulled into the driveway expecting the usual quiet suburban scene, the house I had financially anchored for years sitting still and dignified behind its trimmed hedges. Instead, I saw my Tesla parked at an angle near the curb, sunlight glinting off the hood like it belonged in a dealership ad. My stomach tightened. I had left it there 2 weeks earlier before flying out for a client audit, trusting that it would be safe in my parents' garage. As I stepped closer, the driver's side door opened. Savannah slid out, sunglasses perched on her head, silk blouse draped effortlessly, like she was stepping out of her own vehicle. She smiled when she saw me, but it wasn't the smile of someone caught doing something wrong. It was casual, comfortable. "Oh, good," she said lightly. "You're back. I was just testing it. The steering feels a little tight." Testing it. I stared at her, waiting for a follow-up that never came. An apology. An explanation. Something acknowledging that she was sitting in a car I had worked brutal overtime to afford. Instead, she leaned back into the seat and ran her hand over the dashboard. The interior's not really my color, though. I would have gone with a warmer beige, but it's still cute. Cute. It wasn't the word itself that hurt. It was the assumption behind it. The assumption that this was shared property, that my ownership was technical, not personal. When I asked her calmly why she was using my car, she shrugged. "Mom said it was fine. I needed something reliable while I figure things out." Figure things out. Those words again. Always temporary. Always justified. I walked into the house, my pulse steady but heavy, and found my mother in the kitchen, arranging flowers like nothing unusual had happened. "Savannah's been driving my car," I said carefully. She didn't even look surprised. "Yes, I told her she could. She needs stability right now." I remember the way she turned to face me then, drying her hands on a towel. Her expression wasn't defensive. It was instructive. "You're strong, Brianna. You don't need it the way she does." That sentence landed with the same quiet force it always did. "You don't need it." I looked toward the hallway, where my father stood halfway between the living room and the kitchen, listening but not intervening. He avoided my eyes, just as he had at the mortgage signing years ago. His silence was predictable now, consistent. It had become part of the furniture. "I left it here for safekeeping," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Not for redistribution." My mother's mouth tightened slightly at the word redistribution. "Don't make this into something it's not," she replied. "Your sister is under pressure. She just went through a huge setback. A little support from you could help her regain her confidence." Confidence. I wanted to ask when my confidence had ever been protected, but I didn't, because the pattern was familiar. Savannah's emotional state always took priority. If she failed, she needed cushioning. If she was stressed, she needed comfort. If she wanted something, it was framed as essential for her well-being. And if I objected, I was reminded of my strength. Strength, I was learning, was a tool others used to minimize my needs. That night at dinner, Savannah talked about new ideas, new opportunities, a rebrand, a partnership. She spoke in sweeping gestures, as if the last 3 collapses were simply chapters in an epic entrepreneurial journey. My mother nodded encouragingly. My father offered small affirmations. No one asked how much debt remained from the last attempt. No one mentioned the credit cards. No one acknowledged that the house they were sitting in was tied to my name. I sat there quietly, feeling more like a sponsor than a sister. After dinner, I stepped outside for air. The evening was cool, quiet, the suburban street glowing under soft porch lights. From inside, I could hear Savannah laughing light, carefree. I thought about the hours I had worked to buy that car, the nights I stayed up auditing security systems while eating cold leftovers, the vacations I postponed, the apartment I chose because it was practical, not luxurious. And then I thought about how easily my car had become communal. It wasn't about transportation. It was about entitlement. The next morning, when I asked for the keys back, Savannah rolled her eyes slightly, but handed them over. "You're being dramatic," she muttered. Dramatic. It was a word I'd heard before whenever I tried to draw a boundary. My mother sighed softly. "This tension isn't necessary," she said. "We're family. If you wanted family." That word had started to feel conditional. On the drive back to my apartment, I felt something I hadn't felt before, not just hurt, but clarity. The Tesla incident wasn't an isolated event. It was a symptom, a small but undeniable example of how blurred the lines had become. My belongings were accessible. My income was assumed. My sacrifices were expected. And my discomfort was inconvenient. When I returned to my apartment, I stood in the quiet space I paid for entirely on my own. The contrast was stark. There was no one here expecting me to finance their comfort. No one here minimizing my exhaustion. No one here telling me I was strong enough to go without. The silence felt honest. Over the following weeks, the pattern only intensified. Savannah's wedding planning accelerated. Deposits were placed. Upgrades were discussed. I wasn't formally asked to fund anything. At first it was more subtle than that. "We're just a little short this month." The venue requires an early payment. The florist increased their rates unexpectedly. Every conversation carried the same underlying assumption. I would absorb the gap. And every time I hesitated, I could see the disappointment in my mother's eyes, not because I couldn't afford it, but because I wasn't immediately volunteering. It was around this time that I began noticing how infrequently anyone called just to ask about me. Not my work schedule, not my health, not my mental state. Unless it was attached to a financial reminder. The more I reflected, the more the Tesla moment stood out in my memory. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was revealing. It showed me how natural it had become for them to access what I owned. How easily my contributions had transformed into shared property. How unquestioned my role as provider had become. And for the first time, I allowed myself to ask a dangerous question. What would happen if I stopped? Not stopped loving them. Not stopped caring. Just stopped financing. I didn't have the answer yet, but I knew one thing with certainty. The next time someone casually reached for something that belonged to me, my money, my assets, my stability, I wouldn't swallow it quietly, because strength without boundaries isn't virtue. It's surrender. And I was starting to realize I had surrendered far more than I ever intended to. After the Tesla incident, something inside me stopped pretending. I didn't explode. I didn't confront anyone dramatically. Outwardly, I continued showing up the same way I always had, sending money when necessary, answering calls when they came, maintaining the image of the reliable daughter. But internally, I started watching more closely. Patterns are hard to unsee once you recognize them. Weeks would pass without a single message from home. No, how are you? No, did you sleep? No, you've been working too hard. The silence would stretch comfortably until a deadline approached. Property tax, insurance renewal, an unexpected repair, that's when my phone would light up. Just checking in. We didn't want to pressure you. Are you doing okay? There was always warmth in the tone. There was always affection, but it was affection tethered to timing. I remember one particular evening when I was sitting in my apartment surrounded by empty coffee cups and scattered project notes. I had just wrapped up a long internal audit and was trying to finish a freelance report before midnight. My head was pounding, and my eyes felt like sandpaper. I picked up my phone and scrolled mindlessly to distract myself. That's when I saw Savannah's latest post. She was seated at a polished wooden table in a high-end steakhouse, candlelight flickering against crystal glasses. The caption read, "Grateful for abundance. Soft life energy only." I stared at the image longer than I should have, because I recognized the date. Earlier that day, my credit card had been charged at that exact restaurant. Savannah had borrowed it just for emergencies when one of her cards reached its limit. She had assured me she would pay it off within a week. The week had come and gone. I closed the app and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence in my apartment wrap around me. It wasn't anger I felt. It was a slow, spreading emptiness, the kind that forms when appreciation never quite arrives. A few days later, I visited the house for dinner. I told myself it was important to stay connected, to avoid isolating. The evening began normally enough, Savannah talking animatedly about floral arrangements for the wedding, my mother nodding approvingly, my father offering occasional half-sentences of agreement. I tried to contribute. I asked practical questions about budgets, timelines, contingency plans. My suggestions were met with polite smiles and quick subject changes. At one point, I mentioned that my utility bill had doubled that winter due to heating costs. I laughed lightly, not expecting solutions, just conversation. A little shared frustration. My mother barely paused before responding. "Savannah needs a new wardrobe for her engagement party," she said. "It's important for her confidence." There was no malice in her tone. No sharpness, just redirection. I felt myself fade from the table. Later that evening, while clearing dishes, I stepped into the hallway and overheard my mother speaking to a neighbor who had stopped by unexpectedly. They were standing near the front door, voices lowered but not enough. "Savannah is the heart of this family," my mother said warmly. "She brings light into every room. Brianna, well, she keeps everything running. She's the engine." I stood frozen. The heart and the engine. The metaphor was almost beautiful if you didn't think too hard about it. Hearts are cherished, protected, celebrated. Engines are maintained, expected, replaced when necessary. In that moment, something inside me didn't break. It recalibrated. I walked back into the kitchen quietly, carrying the weight of that sentence with me. For years, I had believed my value was tied to being dependable, being strong, being capable. I told myself that love didn't always look like softness. Sometimes it looked like trust. But what if trust was just convenience? Every time I tried to express fatigue, I was reminded how fortunate I was. "You have such a stable career," my mother would say. "You're so lucky to be able to support us." Lucky. The word landed differently each time. When I mentioned wanting to scale back on freelance work because I was exhausted, my father spoke up briefly. "You don't want to jeopardize the house," he said gently. Not, "You don't want to jeopardize yourself." The house. The physical structure seemed to carry more urgency than my well-being. Meanwhile, Savannah floated through the house like a protected figure. If she overslept, it was because she needed rest. If she overspent, it was because she deserved comfort. If she argued with vendors, it was because she was passionate. Her flaws were reframed as virtues. Mine were reframed as selfishness whenever I hesitated. One afternoon, I called my mother hoping for something simple, a conversation that wasn't transactional. I told her I had been feeling overwhelmed, that my workload had increased significantly. I expected at least a pause. Instead, she sighed sympathetically and said, "Savannah has been under so much pressure too. Planning a wedding is stressful." The comparison felt absurd, but I didn't challenge it. That's the part that's hardest to admit. I participated in my own erosion. I kept rationalizing, kept believing that if I held things together long enough, balance would eventually emerge. That appreciation would deepen, that the emotional scales would correct themselves. They didn't. My phone would remain silent for weeks until a bill approached, then it would buzz with urgency. "We're short this month. The contractor needs payment. We didn't expect this expense." I began to anticipate it. I could feel the pattern in my bones before the messages arrived. It became mechanical, predictable, as a system log updating. At some point, I realized that I could recite their financial cycles better than I could recall the last time they had asked about my happiness. The truth wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was gradual. Gradual invisibility. Gradual expectation. Gradual replacement of identity with function. And when Savannah's wedding planning intensified, the disparity sharpened. She spoke openly about imported champagne, custom invitations, upgraded lighting installations. I asked gently how they were balancing the costs. "Things will work out," she said breezily. They always had. Because I always stepped in. I remember sitting alone in my apartment one night, reviewing my bank statements. The numbers were clear. I wasn't in danger financially, but I wasn't thriving either. My savings plateaued every quarter due to transfers that were framed as temporary. Temporary had stretched into years. I looked around my quiet living room, small, neat, modest. No designer furniture, no extravagant decor, just practicality. I had chosen stability over indulgence, so I could sustain everyone else's. And yet, I was the one excluded from the definition of family. That realization didn't erupt into fury. It settled into something colder. A quiet awareness that my role had been defined without my consent. The engine, reliable, replaceable, expected to run without overheating. But engines, if pushed too hard without maintenance, eventually stall. And I could feel it happening, not in a dramatic crash, but in the slow, steady draining of energy that no one seemed interested in refilling. For the first time, I began to wonder what it would feel like to be the heart of my own life instead of the machinery behind someone else's. And that thought, more than anything, frightened me. Because it meant change. And change would not be gentle. 2 weeks before the wedding, my mother called and said we needed to have a family meeting. Her voice carried that familiar tone, controlled, calm, but slightly urgent. I almost laughed when I heard the phrase. In our house, family meeting rarely meant connection. It usually meant calculation. I drove to Alexandria that Friday evening under a sky heavy with summer humidity. The house stood exactly as it always had: manicured lawn, warm porch light, the illusion of stability. I remember thinking how solid it looked from the outside, how convincing. When I walked through the front door, there was no hug waiting for me, no warmth. My mother was standing in the living room holding a manila folder. Savannah was sprawled across the couch, scrolling through her phone, legs crossed, silk robe draped elegantly as if she were rehearsing for a bridal magazine shoot. My father hovered near the kitchen doorway, quiet as usual. "We need to go over a few final details," my mother said, gesturing for me to sit. I sat. She didn't ease into it. She didn't ask about my drive. She didn't ask how work was going. Instead, she opened the folder and slid a printed invoice across the coffee table toward me. $12,000. Premium liquor upgrade. Imported champagne. Extended open bar service. I stared at the number longer than necessary, hoping it might rearrange itself into something more reasonable. "Savannah decided to elevate the reception package," my mother explained. "Her social circle expects a certain standard." A certain standard. Savannah didn't even look up from her phone. "It's my wedding," she said lightly. "It only happens once." I felt my jaw tighten. I had already covered more than my share of once-in-a-lifetime expenses for this wedding. Deposits had quietly been shifted toward me. Vendor balances temporarily fronted by my card. I had convinced myself it was easier to pay than to argue. But $12,000 for upgraded alcohol? Why wasn't this budgeted from the beginning? I asked, keeping my tone measured. Savannah finally looked up, her expression faintly irritated. Because plans evolve. You of all people should understand investment. Investment. The word stung. Investment implies return. My mother leaned forward slightly. The venue requires payment by Monday. It's short notice, but you're the only one who can handle it quickly. The only one. I felt the familiar pressure rising, the invisible weight of expectations settling on my shoulders. This was the moment where I would usually exhale, pull out my phone, and say, "Okay, I'll take care of it." But something was different. "My savings are already stretched from the last tax payment," I said. "I can't just produce $12,000 on a whim." My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "Brianna, it's not on a whim. It's for your sister's wedding." Savannah shifted on the couch. "Honestly," she added, "this negativity is exhausting. Every time we talk about something joyful, you turn it into a spreadsheet." A spreadsheet. The word landed like an accusation, as if responsibility were a flaw. I looked around the room at the floral sample books stacked on the coffee table, the glossy wedding magazines, the untouched invoice between us, and realized they hadn't invited me home to participate in celebration. They had invited me home to underwrite it. "When did I agree to fund luxury upgrades?" I asked quietly. "You didn't need to agree," Savannah replied, a hint of condescension slipping into her tone. "Your family." Family. The word sounded almost ironic now. I stood up slowly, walking toward the hallway to create distance before my composure slipped. My heart was pounding, not from anger exactly, but from clarity. Every conversation had the same shape. A request framed as unity. My hesitation framed as hostility. In the hallway, I paused to breathe. That's when I heard voices from the kitchen. Savannah and Derek. Their tones were softer, less performative than when they spoke in front of me. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the house carried sound easily. "I told you she'd resist," Derek said quietly. "She'll cave," Savannah replied. "She always does." I froze. Derek's voice lowered. "If not, we can offset it with the car." The car. My stomach dropped. "I've already reviewed the paperwork," he continued. "Private collectors would pay quickly, especially if we move it before the honeymoon." Savannah laughed, light, amused, confident. "She won't notice right away. She's too busy saving the world from hackers." The words felt surreal, detached, like I was listening to strangers discuss a hypothetical asset instead of my property. They weren't just assuming access to my money. They were planning around it. I stepped back into the kitchen before I could overthink it. Derek was leaning against the counter with a stack of documents in his hands. My documents. The vehicle title paperwork. Savannah didn't flinch when she saw me. She didn't even look embarrassed. "What exactly are you doing?" I asked. Derek smiled in that polite, controlled way people do when they believe they hold leverage. "Just exploring options," he said. "You've been generous, but we don't want you to feel burdened." Burdened. Savannah crossed her arms. "You act like we're stealing from you," she said. "We're building something bigger." "With my assets," I replied. She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "You should be grateful you can contribute. It gives you purpose." Purpose. The word hit harder than it should have. I realized then that they didn't see my contributions as sacrifices. They saw them as inevitabilities, tools at their disposal, extensions of their entitlement. My mother entered the kitchen just then, alerted by the rising tension. She took one look at the scene and positioned herself instinctively beside Savannah. "This doesn't need to escalate," she said firmly. "We're discussing family resources." Family resources. The phrase made my skin prickle. "My car is not a family resource," I said evenly. My mother's expression hardened. "You're being dramatic. Derek is trying to secure their future." "At my expense." The thought hovered unspoken but heavy. For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt dense, charged. I could feel something inside me shifting, not anger, not yet. Something colder, more decisive. This wasn't about $12,000. This was about ownership, boundaries, Autonomy. They weren't asking anymore. They were assuming. And assumption is dangerous when it's built on years of unchallenged access. I stepped back slowly, looking at each of them in turn. My father stood near the doorway, eyes lowered, silent as always. Savannah looked irritated. Derek looked calculating. My mother looked offended that I had disrupted the flow of expectation. In that kitchen, surrounded by people who shared my blood but not my perspective, I understood something fully for the first time. They didn't think I would ever say no. Not truly. Not in a way that had consequences. They believed my role was fixed, permanent, predictable. The engine. But engines overheat when pushed too far. And for the first time, I wasn't just aware of the imbalance. I was ready to interrupt it. I left the house that night with the invoice still unpaid and a heaviness in my chest that felt different from exhaustion. It felt like momentum building, because what I had overheard in that kitchen wasn't just entitlement, it was strategy. And they had no idea that I had finally started thinking strategically too. I didn't sleep much after that night. The conversation I overheard in the kitchen kept replaying in my head on a loop. She'll cave, she always does. The casual confidence in Savannah's voice wasn't just irritating, it was revealing. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't desperation. It was certainty. They were certain of me. Certain that no matter how far they pushed, I would bend. Certain that my love would always outweigh my limits. And the most unsettling part? They had 10 years of evidence to support that belief. The next morning, I tried to focus on work. I logged into my systems, reviewed reports, attended meetings. But my mind kept drifting back to the image of Derek holding my car title paperwork, like it was an item up for auction. I thought about the way Savannah laughed. Not nervously, not guiltily, just amused. The Tesla wasn't just a vehicle, it was a boundary. One of the few things I had bought entirely for myself, without justification, without explanation. It represented something simple: ownership, and they were treating it like a communal asset. By lunchtime, I had convinced myself I needed clarity, not confrontation, clarity. Maybe I had misinterpreted something. Maybe the conversation was exaggerated in my memory. Maybe Derek had been bluffing. So, I drove back to the house that evening unannounced. The sun was dipping low when I pulled into the driveway. My car wasn't there. For a split second, my heart jumped, but then I remembered I had taken it back the night before. I almost laughed at how quickly anxiety had become reflex. I walked inside quietly. The house smelled faintly of expensive candles and new fabric samples. Wedding planning had turned every surface into a staging area. Voices drifted from the living room. Savannah and Derek again. I paused just outside the doorway, not hiding exactly, but not announcing myself either. Derek was leaning forward, laptop open on the coffee table. Savannah sat beside him, legs tucked under her, glass of wine in hand. If we list it discreetly, Derek was saying, scrolling through something on the screen, we can move it fast. Collectors pay premium for low mileage. My chest tightened. Before or after the honeymoon? Savannah asked casually. Before, he replied. Liquid assets are better. Less traceable than moving funds around. Less traceable. The words felt deliberate, intentional. Savannah tilted her head. She'll freak out if she finds out. Derek shrugged. Only if she finds out. And even then, what's she going to do? It's family. Family. That word again, wielded like immunity. I stepped into the room. What exactly are you planning? I asked. They both turned toward me, but neither looked startled. That was what struck me most. They weren't scrambling to close the laptop. They weren't hiding papers. They weren't embarrassed. Savannah's lips curved into a slow smile. Relax, she said. We're just discussing options. Options that involve selling my car? I asked evenly. Derek closed the laptop calmly. We were brainstorming, he said. It's temporary. You've helped so much already. This would just balance things out. Balance. I felt something cold settle in my chest. You don't get to balance things with assets that aren't yours, I replied. Savannah set her glass down and stood up. Her expression shifted, not angry, not ashamed, dismissive. You act like we're exploiting you, she said. You're the one who always says family supports each other. Support. I never said support meant liquidation, I answered. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. You don't understand pressure. This wedding matters. Derek's business needs flexibility. You're stable. We're building something. With my resources, I said quietly. Derek sighed, as if this conversation were inconvenient. You're looking at it the wrong way. If the car sits unused most of the time, it's inefficient capital. I stared at him. I had spent years working with financial systems, with risk management frameworks, with cybersecurity models designed to prevent exploitation. And here he was reducing my personal property to a liquidity strategy. It's not capital, I said slowly. It's mine. Savannah crossed her arms. You're so dramatic, she muttered. It's just a car. Just a car. It was never just a car. It was autonomy. And the fact that they couldn't or wouldn't see that told me everything I needed to know. What would you have done? I asked carefully. If I hadn't overheard you yesterday. Savannah didn't blink. You wouldn't have known. The honesty was breathtaking. Not cruel. Not shouted. Just factual. In that moment, something fundamental shifted inside me. It wasn't rage. It was recalibration. The kind that happens when denial is no longer sustainable. They weren't operating emotionally. They were operating strategically. And I had been operating sentimentally. My mother entered the room at that moment, drawn by the tension in my voice. She looked from me to Savannah to Derek, assessing quickly. What's going on? She asked. Brianna thinks we're stealing from her, Savannah replied, rolling her eyes. My mother's expression hardened slightly. Is that what you think? I heard them discussing selling my car, I said. Discussing, she repeated, emphasizing the word. Not doing, but planning, I replied. She shook her head. You're always assuming the worst. Am I? The question hovered between us. I looked at her, searching for even a flicker of recognition that something was wrong. Instead, I saw irritation, as if my objection were an obstacle. You have so much, she continued. Why is it so hard to share? Because sharing implies consent. Because sharing implies reciprocity. Because sharing is not the same as appropriation. But I didn't say those words out loud. Instead, I felt something else solidify, a boundary forming. Not announced, not dramatic, just internal. Savannah sighed dramatically. This is exactly why we didn't want you involved in every detail. You complicate everything. Complicate. I had complicated their assumption of access. And they resented it. For years, I had believed that my restraint was maturity, that swallowing discomfort was grace, that avoiding conflict was love. Standing there in that living room, watching my sister and her fiancé calculate my assets like numbers on a spreadsheet, I realized something far less romantic. My silence had trained them. It had taught them that my limits were flexible, that my ownership was negotiable, that my love was guaranteed no matter the cost. And now, they were operating within the system I had allowed. The engine, always running, never overheating, never shutting down. But engines, when pushed beyond design, don't explode immediately. They grind, they strain, they reach a point where continuation causes damage. As I stood there, I felt that threshold approaching, not because they had discussed selling my car, but because they had discussed it without fear, without hesitation, without considering me at all. That was the real fracture. Not the car, not the money, the absence of hesitation. I left shortly after, without raising my voice, without delivering ultimatums. The calmness unsettled them more than anger would have. On the drive home, I didn't cry. I replayed every moment from the past decade, every temporary contribution, every guilt-laced reminder, every assumption that my resources were communal. And for the first time, I didn't ask how to explain myself better. I asked something else entirely. What would happen if I stopped reacting emotionally and started responding strategically? They believed I would cave. They believed I would adjust. They believed I would absorb. They were wrong. They just didn't know it yet. When I stepped fully into that living room and confronted them, I expected at least a flicker of discomfort, a glance away, a guilty shift in posture, something that would suggest they understood the line they were approaching. I got none of it. Derek remained seated, one hand resting calmly on his laptop, as if we were discussing quarterly projections instead of my personal property. Savannah stood with her arms crossed, chin slightly lifted, eyes steady. There was no panic. No scrambling to defend themselves. Only irritation that I had interrupted the flow of their plan. "You're overreacting," Savannah said again, softer this time, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "No one is stealing anything." "Then why were you discussing how quickly it could be sold?" I asked. Derek gave a small, almost amused exhale. "Because we're trying to solve a liquidity issue efficiently. It's not personal." Not personal. That phrase lodged in my chest. Of course it wasn't personal to him. It wasn't his name on the loan agreements. It wasn't his overtime hours that paid for that car. It wasn't his future that had quietly been underwriting this entire household. Savannah stepped closer to me, lowering her voice, as if trying to de-escalate something she believed was emotional rather than justified. "You always make things so heavy," she said. "This is about momentum. We're building a life together. You're stable. You don't even use the car half the time." "I use it," I replied. "And even if I didn't, that wouldn't make it available." She tilted her head. "You're so attached to objects." Attached. The implication was clear. My reaction was sentimental, irrational, selfish, as if ownership were immaturity. "It's not attachment," I said carefully. "It's boundaries." Derek stood up then, slipping into what I recognized immediately as negotiation posture. Calm shoulders, even tone, controlled eye contact. "Let's be realistic," he said. "You've supported this family for years. This isn't new. We're not asking for something unprecedented. We're optimizing resources." Optimizing resources. I felt a strange, almost detached awareness rise in me. I analyze cyber threats for a living. I identify patterns in behavior. I understand risk modeling. And standing there, listening to him speak, I realized something unsettling. This wasn't desperation. This was entitlement disguised as logic. "You don't optimize what isn't yours," I said. Savannah rolled her eyes. "God, you're acting like we're criminals." The word hung in the air. Criminals. For a moment, none of us spoke. My mother appeared in the doorway just then, drawn by the shift in tone. She scanned the room quickly, reading faces the way she always did when tension surfaced. "What is happening?" she asked. "Brianna thinks we're planning to steal her car," Savannah said immediately. My mother's gaze snapped to me. "Is that true?" "I heard them discussing selling it before the honeymoon," I replied. "Discussing," she repeated, again with emphasis. "There's a difference. A difference that disappears if I hadn't overheard it," I said quietly. That was when her expression changed. Not into guilt, into offense. "You're twisting this," she said. "Derek is trying to protect their financial stability. You should admire that." "Admire that." I stared at her, waiting for the part where she acknowledged that my stability was the one being eroded. Instead, she stepped closer to Savannah, placing a hand lightly on her arm, a subtle, protective gesture she had perfected over decades. "Your sister has been under tremendous stress," she continued. "The wedding, the expectations. You know how sensitive she is." Sensitive. Savannah's sensitivity had always been a shield. If she was upset, we rearranged ourselves around her. If she was overwhelmed, we absorbed it. If she failed, we funded recovery. And if I objected, I was cold. "You're strong," my mother added, her voice softening just enough to sound persuasive. "You don't need the same comforts she does." There it was again. The familiar reframing. Strength as justification for deprivation. Derek, sensing momentum shifting in his favor, spoke again. "We're not trying to harm you. We're trying to build something sustainable. The honeymoon, the wedding, the new business direction, these things require capital. Short-term asset conversion isn't theft." He said it like he had rehearsed it. Asset conversion. My life had become a portfolio to them. "You didn't even ask," I said. Savannah's expression hardened slightly. "Because you always say yes." The simplicity of that statement cut deeper than the rest. Because she was right, I had always said yes. Not loudly, not enthusiastically, but consistently. And consistency creates expectation. Expectation becomes assumption. Assumption becomes entitlement. You mistake compliance for consent, I said quietly. Savannah laughed, but there was less ease in it now. Don't turn this into a moral lecture. It's a car. You can buy another. I thought about the hours it took to afford it. The nights spent hunched over a laptop while everyone else slept. The small pleasures I denied myself so I could feel financially secure. You don't replace effort that easily, I said. My father cleared his throat from the hallway. He hadn't spoken yet. He rarely did in moments like this. His presence was passive but influential silence that reinforced whichever side my mother stood on. Maybe we should all calm down, he offered weakly. Calm down. The phrase felt like dismissal. I realized then that none of them were actually hearing me. They were hearing resistance, inconvenience, disruption of a system that had worked perfectly for them. Savannah stepped forward again, her voice dropping into something sharper. You know what this really is? She said. You're jealous. The word stunned me. Jealous of what? I asked. That I'm starting a family, that I'm building something exciting, that people celebrate me. The audacity of it was almost surreal. This isn't jealousy, I replied. It's accountability. It's met his now. She shook her head. You've always hidden behind spreadsheets and logic. You don't understand what it takes to create something meaningful. Meaningful. I looked around the room, the house I had financially secured, the wedding I had indirectly subsidized, the comfort they all lived in. Meaningful. If meaning requires taking without asking, I said evenly, then maybe we define it differently. For a moment, no one spoke. I could feel the air shifting, the room tightening. My refusal wasn't loud, but it was firm, and firmness was unfamiliar territory. My mother's voice cut through the silence. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. No, I said quietly. It's already big. I just stopped pretending it isn't. Savannah's jaw tightened. So what? You're going to cut us off over a car? That question lingered. Because it wasn't about the car. It was about the precedent. If they could sell my car without hesitation, what else would become negotiable? My credit? My identity? My future? I didn't say that aloud. Instead, I stepped back toward the door. I'm not arguing anymore, I said. The car isn't being sold, and this conversation isn't up for optimization. Derek's expression cooled. You're being unreasonable. Maybe. Or maybe I was finally being proportionate. As I walked out of the house that evening, I felt something unfamiliar. Not sadness. Not even anger. Detachment. For the first time, I saw the structure clearly. The way each of them played a role. Savannah as the entitled visionary, Derek as the calculated opportunist, my mother as the orchestrator disguised as peacemaker, my father as the silent reinforcement, and me, the engine, expected to run, expected to fund, expected to forgive. But engines, when they begin to overheat, don't announce it dramatically. They change temperature slowly. And in that living room, surrounded by calm entitlement, I realized something critical. They didn't believe I would ever shut down. They thought I would always adjust. They were about to learn what happens when the system stops responding the way it always has. And this time, I wasn't going to explain myself again. The argument didn't explode the way arguments usually do. There was no shouting match that night, no dramatic exit with doors slamming behind me. It was quieter than that, which somehow made it worse. After I said the car wasn't being sold and the discussion wasn't open for negotiation, an uncomfortable stillness settled over the room. Savannah crossed her arms. Derek's expression hardened. My mother watched me with something colder than anger disapproval. You're creating tension where there doesn't need to be any, she said finally, her voice clipped but controlled. No, I replied. I'm responding to tension that's already there. That was when she reached into the folder she'd been carrying earlier and pulled out another document. It wasn't related to the liquor package this time. It was something else, another authorization form, several pages thick, already tabbed with sticky notes marking signature lines. We might as well handle this while you're here, she said. placing it on the kitchen counter. It's for some administrative adjustments regarding the house. Just a formality. I stared at the pages. Administrative adjustments? I asked. Yes, she replied smoothly. It's simply to allow Derek temporary access to coordinate certain financial logistics for the wedding. Nothing dramatic. It just streamlines things. Streamlines. The word echoed in my head. Streamlining, optimizing, redistributing. Their language had become suspiciously technical whenever my assets were involved. I'd like to review it with my attorney, I said calmly. The temperature in the room shifted immediately. There's no need for that, my mother replied, too quickly. It's a family matter. If it involves my signature and my financial standing, I said. It's not just a family matter. Savannah exhaled sharply. Why are you acting like we're trying to trap you? I didn't answer that. Because the truth was, I didn't know how far they were willing to go. But I had learned something crucial in cybersecurity: never sign what you don't fully understand, especially when urgency is applied. Sign it, my mother said again, her tone firmer now. You've always trusted us. Trusted. Trust had been my most expensive investment. I'm not signing anything tonight, I replied. The silence that followed was heavy and brittle. My father stood near the doorway again, hovering, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He looked uncomfortable, but not enough to intervene. You're being paranoid, Savannah muttered. No, I said softly. I'm being cautious. That's when my mother's composure cracked. Her face changed, not dramatically, not with theatrics, but with something raw and sharp. Her eyes hardened in a way I had rarely seen directed at me. You know what this is? She said. This is jealousy. The accusation again. Jealousy doesn't sign documents blindly, I replied. Her jaw tightened. You can't stand that your sister is moving forward, that she's building something meaningful. I felt something inside me cool even further. This has nothing to do with meaning, I said. It has to do with consent. She stepped closer to me, lowering her voice. A loyal daughter wouldn't hesitate like this. A loyal daughter. The phrase landed like a verdict. For years, loyalty had been the invisible thread pulling me back every time I considered drawing a line. Loyalty had meant covering gaps, filling silence, smoothing over discomfort. But loyalty without reciprocity isn't devotion. It's dependency. I've been loyal for 10 years, I said quietly. That doesn't require blind obedience. The next moment happened so quickly it felt detached from time. Her hand moved before I registered it. A sharp, stinging impact across my cheek. The sound echoed in the kitchen louder than it should have been. For a second, I didn't react. Not because it didn't hurt, but because the shock wasn't physical. It was existential. My mother had just hit me for refusing to sign a document. I slowly lifted my hand to my face, feeling the warmth spreading under my skin. Savannah stood frozen. Derek looked stunned but said nothing. My father remained exactly where he was, silent. That silence was louder than the slap. I looked at him, waiting for something, an objection, a reprimand, even a small step forward. Nothing. He avoided my eyes. In that instant, something final settled inside me. The slap wasn't just anger. It was a message. My resistance was unacceptable. My boundaries were offensive. My autonomy was disobedience. You're trying to sabotage your sister's happiness, my mother said, her voice trembling with rage. After everything we've done for you. It's that it takes place. Everything we've done for you. The inversion was breathtaking. For a moment, I considered arguing. Listing the mortgage payments, the taxes, the transfers, the credit lines extended. But I realized something critical. They didn't see those as sacrifices. They saw them as obligations. Explaining myself would only reinforce that dynamic. So instead of yelling, instead of defending, I did something I had never done before. I disengaged. I stepped back slowly, lowering my hand from my cheek. I won't sign it, I said, my voice steady. And if that makes me disloyal in your eyes, then maybe we need to redefine what loyalty means. My mother's chest rose and fell rapidly. Savannah looked between us, unsettled by the shift. Derek's posture tightened, as if recalculating. My father still didn't speak. That hurt more than the sting on my face. Because his silence wasn't confusion. It was choice. I picked up my bag from the chair by the door. "You're overreacting," Savannah said weakly. "Maybe," I replied. "Or maybe I've just been underreacting for years." I walked toward the front door without waiting for permission or forgiveness. My mother called my name once, sharply, but I didn't turn around. The rain had started outside light at first, then heavier. I stepped into it without hesitation. The cool water against my skin felt grounding, almost cleansing. As I reached my car, I paused. Not because I was reconsidering, but because I understood something with absolute clarity. The slap wasn't the beginning of the fracture, it was the confirmation. If my refusal to sign a document warranted violence, then the foundation of our relationship had already eroded beyond repair. I sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, rain streaking across the windshield, my cheek still warm. My phone buzzed once in my bag. Then again. Then again. I didn't look. For the first time in years, I didn't feel guilt rising automatically to the surface. I felt relief. Relief that the illusion had shattered completely. Relief that the dynamic was finally visible in its full shape. They believed I would always comply. They believed pressure would always bend me. They believed my strength meant endurance without limits. They were wrong. And as I started the engine and drove away from the house I had financed but never truly belonged to, I realized something that frightened and empowered me at the same time. The person who walked out that door was not the same daughter who had walked in, and they had no idea how much that would cost them. I sat in my car for a long time after I left the house that night, the rain drumming steadily against the windshield, my cheek still warm from where my mother's hand had struck me. The sting faded quickly. What lingered was something far deeper, a clarity so sharp it almost felt surgical. For years, I had been negotiating emotionally, explaining, justifying, hoping that if I framed things gently enough, logically enough, they would understand. But standing there in that kitchen, being asked to sign another ambiguous document and then being slapped when I refused, something irreversible had happened. It wasn't just a fight. It was a boundary crossed. And I finally understood that this wasn't a misunderstanding I could smooth over with another transfer or another compromise. This wasn't about wedding stress. It wasn't about temporary liquidity. It was about control. My phone buzzed again in my bag. Then again. Calls stacked on top of each other. My mother. Savannah. My father. I didn't answer any of them. For once, I didn't feel the reflex to fix it. Instead, I did something that felt both terrifying and grounding. I called my attorney. Mr. Benson had handled minor contract reviews for me before, nothing dramatic. He was precise, calm, and unflappable. When he answered, I heard the quiet hum of an office in the background. "Brianna," he said, surprised. "Everything okay?" "No," I replied simply. "It's not." I explained the situation without dramatizing it. The mortgage guarantee, the escalating financial expectations, the wedding invoice, the attempt to sell my car, the document they tried to pressure me into signing. The slap. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. When I finished, there was a pause on the line. "You need to separate yourself immediately," he said finally. "Legally and financially. No more informal arrangements. No more verbal understandings." 80R Joe. I leaned back against the seat, rain still falling outside. "I think it's past mediation," I admitted. "It is," he replied calmly. "You've been functioning as their financial backbone without protection. That ends now." There was something incredibly stabilizing about hearing it framed that way. Not emotional, not dramatic, just structural. "That ends now. I want to untangle everything," I said. "The house, the guarantees, any access they have to my accounts. All of it. It's dairy hours." "Then we move quickly," he replied. "Start documenting everything, every payment, every communication, and do not sign anything else." That part, at least, was simple. When I hung up, the rain had slowed. The world outside looked washed, slightly blurred. I started the engine and drove back to my apartment, feeling strangely lighter. Not happy, but resolved. For years, My loyalty had been automatic. My guilt had been immediate. That night, neither showed up. In their place was something steadier strategy. Back in my apartment, I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. Not for work this time. For myself. I reviewed bank statements going back 3 years. Mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance premiums, vendor deposits for the wedding that had quietly landed on my cards. Transfers labeled temporary help. Temporary. The word felt almost mocking now. I created folders, organized documentation, screenshot confirmations, downloaded transaction histories. The process felt strangely familiar, like investigating a breach. Because in a way, that's exactly what this was. Not a technical breach, a relational one. Somewhere along the line, access had expanded beyond consent. Expectations had overwritten agreements. My financial identity had been integrated into a system that no longer protected me. As I worked, my phone continued buzzing intermittently on the desk. Voicemails piled up. I didn't listen to them. Not yet. Around midnight, I finally allowed myself to sit still. The apartment was quiet, painfully quiet, in a way that felt new. I realized something then. For years, I had equated peace with loneliness, silence with abandonment. I had tolerated imbalance because at least it meant connection. But this silence wasn't lonely. It was clean. The next morning, I drafted a formal email to the bank regarding the mortgage structure. I requested clarification on my liability as guarantor and began exploring the process of removing myself from future obligations. Mr. Benson responded quickly with guidance on dispute protocols and legal steps. For the first time in years, I felt like I was acting in my own interest instead of reacting to someone else's crisis. That didn't mean it didn't hurt. When I finally listened to the voicemails, my mother's voice oscillated between outrage and disbelief. "How could you embarrass us like that?" she demanded in one message. In another, she sounded wounded. "You've changed." Savannah's messages were sharper. "You're being dramatic. You're ruining everything. You've always been jealous." My father left one short voicemail. "Call your mother." That was it. No acknowledgement of the slap. No recognition of the pressure. Just instruction. I deleted the messages without replying. Not out of cruelty. Out of necessity. Over the next 2 days, I worked closely with Mr. Benson to draft formal notices. I froze shared access points, changed passwords, activated additional authentication protocols on all major accounts. I wasn't paranoid, I was precautionary. Because if they had been comfortable pressuring me into signing documents, I couldn't assume they wouldn't try something more subtle. The shift in my behavior unsettled them. I could tell from the increased frequency of calls. But something inside me had recalibrated. I wasn't fighting anymore. I was restructuring. And restructuring isn't loud. It's deliberate. One evening, as I reviewed paperwork, I realized something that stopped me cold. For years, I had believed my greatest fear was losing them. But sitting there, untangling financial threads that should never have been woven together, I understood the deeper fear had always been something else. Losing myself. That was the cost I had almost paid. And that realization solidified my resolve more than any argument ever could. The time for emotional negotiation was over. The time for clarity had begun. And if they thought the wedding was the stage for celebration, they had no idea it was about to become the stage for consequence. 2 days after I made the decision to formally separate myself from everything, I was sitting in my office finishing a security review when my encrypted messaging app chimed with a priority alert. It was Jordan. Jordan and I had worked together on several high-level cybersecurity projects over the years. He was methodical, calm under pressure, and the kind of analyst who noticed irregularities most people would dismiss. If he marked something urgent, it wasn't casual. "Call me." "Now," the message read. I stepped into a private conference room and dialed him immediately. His face appeared on the screen, serious in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Tell me you changed your passwords recently," he said without greeting. "I did," I replied. "Why?" He turned his laptop slightly so I could see his screen. "Logs, timestamps, IP traces. There were multiple login attempts on your financial and tax accounts last night," he said. Sophisticated enough to bypass basic alerts, but not sophisticated enough to avoid detection entirely. My pulse slowed, not from calm, but from focus. Location? I asked. He hesitated for half a second. Residential IP in Alexandria, same block as your parents' house. The room felt smaller. I stared at the screen, watching the timestamps scroll past. Someone had systematically attempted to access my primary financial portal. Not random guessing. Structured attempts. Sequential. They weren't just poking around, Jordan continued. They were mapping your recovery pathways. Recovery pathways. Security questions. Secondary email access. Backup authentication routes. A cold realization slid into place. My mother knew the answers to my childhood security questions. Favorite teacher, first pet, birth city, things I had never thought to treat as vulnerabilities. They reset anything? I asked. Jordan shook his head. Not successfully. Your new authentication layers blocked the final step. But Brianna, this wasn't curiosity. This was intent. Intent. For a moment, I wanted to believe it was coincidence. A neighbor's compromised router. A spoofed address. Anything less direct. But the pattern didn't feel accidental. It felt targeted. We dug deeper. Jordan ran additional scans and flagged an anomaly in my credit monitoring alerts, something subtle enough to escape standard notifications. A hard inquiry from a lending institution I didn't recognize. My heart skipped. I didn't apply for anything, I said. I know, he replied. We pulled the report. There it was. A loan application submitted 48 hours earlier under my legal name and social security number. The amount made my vision blur slightly. $500,000. I forced myself to breathe evenly. Status? I asked. Approved, Jordan said quietly. Funds dispersed. Dispersed. My mind moved quickly now. Not emotionally, but analytically. If the funds had cleared, they had gone somewhere specific. Trace the receiving account, I said. He nodded, fingers moving across his keyboard. The trail wasn't perfectly hidden. It wasn't amateur either. Layered transfers. Temporary routing through a business account before settling offshore. When he turned the screen back toward me, the name attached to the final account was one I recognized immediately. Derek. The room went silent, except for the low hum of the conference room ventilation. This can't be real, I whispered, though I already knew it was. Jordan didn't soften it. They cloned your digital signature, he said. It's sophisticated. The handwriting analysis would pass automated checks. I felt something inside my chest compress, not panic, not rage. Something colder. They'd need access to more than my basic info, I said slowly. Multi-factor authentication. Verification sequences. And in quote. Jordan nodded. Someone with personal knowledge could have reset the secondary credentials. Personal knowledge. Images flashed through my mind. My mother sitting at the kitchen table years ago asking about childhood memories. My answers to casual, security question conversations over the years. Her access to my mail when I was younger. The way she remembered details effortlessly. She handed them the key, I said quietly. Jordan didn't argue. We reviewed the timestamps again. The reset attempts, the successful verification, the final authorization. It had happened within hours of the night. I refused to sign the document. The timing wasn't random. It was retaliatory. They weren't just trying to use you, Jordan said carefully. They were trying to bind you. Bind. $500,000 would take years to unwind if left uncontested. It would anchor my credit, limit my options, force me back into dependency. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the digital evidence like it belonged to someone else's life. For years, I had funded their comfort voluntarily. This was different. This was force. I need everything, I said finally. Logs, access trails, screenshots. We document it all. Jordan nodded. I'll compile a full report. You need to contact your attorney immediately. And the bank. Fraud division. I stood up slowly, my reflection faintly visible in the darkened conference room window. My expression looked unfamiliar still, composed, almost detached. The slap in the kitchen had hurt. This felt like something else entirely. Calculated. Deliberate. They thought I wouldn't check, I murmured. Jordan met my eyes through the screen. They underestimated you. Maybe. Or maybe they had grown too comfortable with the version of me who absorbed everything quietly. I left the conference room and stepped into the hallway, phone already in hand. I called Mr. Benson before I allowed myself to process emotionally. Identity theft, I said when he answered. $500,000. Funds already moved. There was no panic in his voice, only precision. Do not contact them directly. Freeze the accounts. File a formal fraud dispute immediately. We move fast. Fast. Yes. This wasn't family tension anymore. It was a criminal act. As I walked back to my desk, I felt the weight of something heavier than betrayal. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't wedding stress. This was a coordinated effort to anchor my future to their ambition. They hadn't just crossed a boundary. They had tried to erase mine entirely. And for the first time in 10 years, I didn't feel guilt. I felt focus. Because if they wanted to play strategically, they had just chosen the wrong opponent. And they had no idea how thoroughly I was about to respond. The moment I hung up with my attorney, something inside me went completely still. Not numb, not shocked. Still, for years, I had reacted emotionally to my family's behavior, hurt, disappointed, exhausted, occasionally angry. But this was different. A $500,000 loan filed under my identity wasn't emotional manipulation. It was deliberate, structured harm. And the worst part? It wasn't impulsive. It required planning, access, coordination. They had prepared for this. So now, so would I. Jordan stayed on the line with me while I locked down every primary financial access point. Password resets, hardware authentication keys, emergency contact removal, secondary email deletion, backup phone number change. I activated alerts so aggressive that even a login attempt from a slightly unfamiliar location would trigger notification. Every keystroke felt like reclaiming territory. I called the lending institution's fraud department next. My voice was calm, almost eerily calm, as I reported identity theft, provided timestamps, and requested an immediate freeze on the loan. They began an internal review process and temporarily suspended activity on the account pending investigation. It wasn't enough to undo the damage yet. But it bought time. Time was leverage. Mr. Benson instructed me to redirect all mortgage-related payments into a controlled escrow account while the fraud investigation unfolded. If I continued paying directly, it could be interpreted as tacit approval of the broader financial entanglement. So, I rerouted the next scheduled transfer. For the first time in years, the house in Alexandria was not automatically funded by me. I didn't notify them. I didn't warn them. Silence can be strategic. Over the next several hours, Jordan and I mapped the digital footprint of the loan application in detail. He compiled logs that traced the reset attempts back to the residential IP tied to my parents' address. The sequence was clear. Password recovery triggered. Secondary verification completed. Loan application submitted. Funds routed through an intermediary account, then transferred offshore to an account in Derek's name. It was methodical, not desperate, calculated. The realization didn't shatter me. It clarified me. I remembered Savannah's voice in the hallway days earlier. She'll cave. She always does. They believed my compliance was predictable. They believed my identity was accessible. They believed consequences were unlikely. That belief would be their mistake. 5 days before the wedding, the official ceremony at a coastal resort was set to begin. The venue was expensive, the guest list curated, the aesthetic meticulously planned. Savannah had talked about it as if it were a coronation. They had planned to celebrate publicly on a foundation built from private theft. And somewhere between filing fraud documentation and restructuring my financial architecture, a thought formed quietly. If they wanted spectacle, I could give them timing. But this wasn't revenge for the sake of humiliation. It was containment. The funds were already dispersed. The investigation would take weeks, possibly months. Meanwhile, they were operating under the assumption that their plan had succeeded, that I was unaware, that my silence was ignorance. I didn't correct them. Instead, I prepared. Jordan helped me implement a series of monitoring triggers tied to any further movement from the fraudulent loan account. If funds shifted, alerts would fire. If associated cards were used, flags would activate. I ensured my credit bureaus were notified and placed extended fraud alerts on all reporting agencies. Layer by layer, I built a perimeter. I also reviewed the wedding-related payments that had passed through my accounts. Several deposits had been made using my card information over the past few months. Some were authorized, some were temporarily borrowed. I contacted the card issuer and marked specific transactions as under dispute pending investigation. I didn't cancel them outright. I scheduled them. That was the difference. Timing is everything in both cybersecurity and strategy. And the wedding was the only moment when their confidence would be absolute. During those days, my phone continued buzzing intermittently with calls and messages from my mother and Savannah. The tone had shifted from anger to confusion. I responded to none of them. The silence unsettled them more than confrontation ever had. Inside my apartment, the atmosphere was different from any other week of my life. It wasn't chaotic, it wasn't frantic, it was focused. I drafted a formal request to the lending institution to terminate any personal guarantees linked to the Alexandria property based on documented fraud activity. Mr. Benson reviewed and filed it on my behalf. He also initiated preliminary communication with law enforcement, not as a dramatic move, but as documentation. We were building a case, not a scene. One evening, as I reviewed the compiled evidence, signature forgeries, timestamp logs, routing accounts, I felt a strange mixture of grief and empowerment. Grief, because this was my family. Empowerment, because I finally understood that protecting myself was not cruelty. It was responsibility. The night before the wedding weekend began, I sat at my desk and looked at the live stream link Savannah had sent weeks earlier back when she still assumed I would be attending as a silent benefactor. Family only, she had written. The irony wasn't lost on me. If I wasn't family, then I had no obligation to preserve the illusion. But even now, I didn't feel vengeful. I felt precise. On the morning of the ceremony, I finalized the fraud dispute escalation. I authorized the lending institution to flag all associated credit lines connected to the fraudulent activity for temporary suspension pending review. That meant any card linked to that funding structure would trigger holds. The resort payment was scheduled to process in stages, and I knew exactly when the largest balance was due. As the afternoon approached, I made tea and placed my laptop on the coffee table. The live stream went live shortly before sunset. Guests filled rows of white chairs overlooking the ocean. Soft music drifted through speakers. Savannah appeared radiant in a designer gown. For a moment, I felt a flicker of something human and complicated. Then I remembered the loan, the forged signatures, the reset attempts from my childhood security questions, the laughter in the hallway. And I exhaled slowly. Jordan texted me, "Triggers armed." I waited, not impulsively, not emotionally, strategically, because sometimes the most powerful move isn't loud. It's timed. And they still believed I didn't know. That was the final miscalculation. By the time the ceremony music reached its crescendo and they prepared to exchange vows, I authorized the final escalation. Credit holds activated. Associated accounts flagged. Payment processing suspended pending fraud investigation. On the live stream, I watched as the resort manager approached the altar with visible urgency. Music faltered, guests shifted, confusion rippled across carefully curated elegance. Savannah's smile faltered. Derek's posture changed instantly from confidence to calculation, and my phone began to vibrate. Again, and again, and again. This time, I didn't ignore it. I watched it light up on the table beside my tea. For years, they had believed I would always cave. Now, for the first time, they understood something else entirely. The engine had stopped running on command, and the system they built on assumption was collapsing under its own weight. 5 days before the wedding, before the live stream, before the resort manager interrupted the ceremony, there was one thing I knew I still needed. Proof. Digital logs were strong. IP traces were compelling. The fraudulent loan documentation was damning, but I needed something irrefutable, something physical, something that would leave no room for denial once this moved beyond family confrontation and into legal territory. And I knew exactly where to find it. I still had a spare key to the house in Alexandria. No one had ever asked for it back. For years, that key had symbolized belonging, access, trust, shared space. That night, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like an entry point. I waited until just after midnight. The neighborhood would be quiet by then. Most lights out. Minimal movement. I wasn't sneaking in to cause harm. I wasn't going in to confront anyone. I was going to retrieve evidence. My hands were steady when I parked down the street and walked toward the house. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and distant rain. From the outside, nothing looked different. The house stood the same way it always had, solid, respectable, financed by my name. I unlocked the door quietly and stepped inside. The silence hit me first. The living room was dim, lit only by a faint glow from a hallway nightlight. Wedding decor samples were still scattered across the coffee table fabric swatches, invitation mock-ups, handwritten guest lists. The illusion of celebration remained intact. I moved carefully toward the small home office near the back of the house. That room had always been my father's territory. A modest desk, an aging desktop computer, filing cabinets that held years of paperwork, mortgage documents, tax returns, insurance policies. If anything had been drafted, printed, rehearsed, or scanned, it would be there. I closed the office door behind me and powered on the computer. The familiar hum of the machine felt almost too loud in the stillness. I kept the screen brightness low. The password wasn't difficult. My father had never believed in complicated security. I logged in easily. At first glance, nothing looked unusual. Standard folders, utilities, insurance, wedding budget spreadsheets. Then I noticed something tucked into a subdirectory labeled Personal Archive. The folder name was bland, unremarkable. Inside, my stomach dropped. There were dozens of high-resolution image files. Each one was a scan of my signature. Not random documents, practice sheets. I clicked one open. It was unmistakable my name, written over and over again across blank pages, some slightly slanted, some traced more heavily than others, variations in pressure, adjustments in curvature. It was rehearsal. They had practiced being me. My hands felt colder now, but my mind remained focused. I continued searching. Another folder contained PDF files of the loan application drafts, early versions, edited versions. A final compiled submission. Then I found it. A video file. Dated from the previous month. I hesitated for only a second before clicking play. The screen filled with the image of Savannah sitting at that very desk. My father's desk. Papers spread in front of her. Derek, standing just behind her shoulder. She was laughing. Not nervously. Not hesitantly. Laughing. "Your B-loops are tighter than hers," Derek said from behind the camera. "Loosen them slightly." Savannah adjusted her grip and tried again. "There," he said. "That's closer." They clinked wine glasses off camera. The sound echoed through the quiet office. For a moment, the air felt too thin to breathe. It wasn't just the forgery, it was the joy, the casual ease of it, the assumption that this was clever, strategic, harmless. I paused the video and closed my eyes briefly. When I opened them again, I felt something new. Not heartbreak. Clarity. I inserted the encrypted flash drive I had brought with me and began copying every file images, PDFs, video, timestamps. The progress bar moved slowly, each percentage point feeling heavier than the last. While the transfer ran, I opened the email drafts folder. There it was. An unsent message from my mother to Derek. Subject line: "She won't notice." The body of the email was short. "She's too busy with work to monitor statements closely. Just move quickly." The timestamp aligned perfectly with the loan submission date. I stared at the screen, reading it twice to ensure I wasn't misinterpreting it. She had known. Not suspected. Known. The sound of a floorboard creaking behind me made my heart jump. I turned slowly. My mother stood in the doorway. She wasn't startled. She wasn't confused. She was angry. "What are you doing?" she demanded, stepping into the room. I didn't close the window. I didn't minimize the files. "Collecting evidence," I said calmly. Her eyes flicked to the screen, then back to me. "You had no right to access this computer." No right. The irony almost made me laugh. "You had no right to access my identity," I replied. Her face tightened. "This is a misunderstanding. It's a coordinated forgery," I said. She stepped forward quickly, reaching toward the desk as if to grab the flash drive. I moved faster, sliding it into my pocket. "You're being dramatic," she said, her voice rising. "Derek is trying to build a future. Savannah is starting a family. You're turning this into something criminal." "Because it is criminal." The words remained in my head. "You knew," I said quietly. "You knew what they were doing." Her jaw trembled, but not with guilt, with indignation. "You've always resented your sister," she snapped. "Now you're trying to destroy her happiness." There it was again. Jealousy. Sabotage. Disloyalty. Labels were easier than accountability. "I'm not destroying anything," I replied evenly. "I'm protecting myself." She crossed her arms. "If you were truly loyal, you would have signed the authorization and trusted us." Trusted. The word had lost all meaning. "I trusted you for 10 years, I said. That was enough. And it was. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the computer. She looked at me then, not as a daughter, not as family, but as an obstacle. "You don't understand what's at stake," she said finally. "I understand exactly what's at stake," I answered. "My name, my credit, my future." I walked past her toward the door, ignoring her demands to explain what I planned to do with the files. She followed me down the hallway, her voice shifting from anger to something closer to panic. "If you go through with this," she warned, "you'll tear this family apart." I paused at the front door. "No," I said softly. "That already happened." And with that, I stepped back into the night, the evidence secure in my pocket, the final illusion gone. The house behind me was no longer a symbol of home. It was a crime scene. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't leaving it feeling small. I was leaving it prepared. I didn't look back at the house when I walked away that night. I expected to feel shaken, maybe even guilty. Instead, I felt disturbingly clear. The flash drive in my pocket felt heavier than it should have, not because of its size, but because of what it represented. Years of quiet compliance had just collided with undeniable proof. When I got back to my apartment, I didn't sit down. I didn't cry. I went straight to my desk, plugged the encrypted drive into my laptop, and opened the files again, this time in my own space, on my own terms. The video played exactly the same as it had in the office. Savannah laughing. Derek correcting the curve of my letters. Wine glasses clinking in celebration over the rehearsal of my identity. The email draft from my mother sat beside it, stark and simple. "She won't notice. She's too busy with work." That line echoed differently now. Not because it was cruel, because it was accurate. I had been too busy working to notice, too busy earning, too busy stabilizing the very system they were quietly exploiting. My diligence had created the blind spot they relied on. I forwarded every file to Mr. Benson through a secure channel and called him immediately. "This is no longer circumstantial," I said when he answered. "I have proof." He didn't ask me what kind. He just said, "Send everything. Do not confront them again. We move formally from here." Formally. The word felt steady, anchoring. Over the next several hours, we built a structured response. Fraud escalation, law enforcement referral, formal notice to the lending institution, a request for immediate termination of any loan guarantees tied to my name due to documented identity theft. Every document I signed that night was deliberate, informed, reviewed. Not like the first mortgage paper 10 years ago. At some point, around 3 in the morning, I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The apartment was silent. The city outside felt distant. I expected sadness. Instead, I felt something closer to relief. Relief that I was no longer guessing. Relief that I no longer had to wonder if I was overreacting. The evidence had removed ambiguity. The next morning, My phone rang before 8. My mother. I let it go to voicemail. Then Savannah. Then my father. Finally, a text from my mother appeared. We need to talk. Now. The urgency was new. The tone had shifted from indignation to something sharper. I didn't respond. An hour later, another message arrived. Don't do anything drastic. Drastic. I almost smiled at that. For 10 years, what they had done to me was incremental, subtle enough to avoid being labeled drastic, but when I finally responded proportionately, it became excessive. I still didn't reply. That afternoon, Mr. Benson called to confirm that preliminary fraud reports had been filed and the loan investigation was officially active. The financial institution had frozen remaining accessible funds and flagged Derek's receiving account for review. Law enforcement would follow up once documentation was processed. It's only a matter of time, he said calmly. Time. The wedding was 3 days away. That evening, my mother showed up at my apartment. She didn't call first. The knock on the door was sharp, controlled. When I opened it, she stood there, composed but strained, her posture rigid. We need to resolve this quietly, she said immediately. Quietly. I stepped aside without inviting her warmth. She walked into my living room and glanced around briefly, as if measuring the space. There was no apology in her expression. You're escalating something that could destroy your sister's future, she said. No, I replied. Your actions did that. Even. Her jaw tightened. Derek was only trying to secure capital. Businesses require risk. With my identity? I asked. You weren't harmed, she insisted. It was temporary. Temporary. The word had haunted my finances for years. $500,000 isn't temporary, I said. It's leverage. Her composure cracked slightly then. You've always been rigid. You don't understand what family sacrifice means. I felt a strange calm settle over me. I do, I said quietly. I've been the only one practicing it. For a moment, her eyes flickered, not with guilt, but with something closer to fear. If you go through with this, she said, lowering her voice, Savannah's wedding will collapse. Do you want that on your conscience? Conscience. The word might have shaken me months ago. Now, it didn't. They tried to bind my future to debt, I replied. That's on theirs. She stepped closer. You're choosing pride over family. No, I said. I'm choosing survival over exploitation. The room went still. For the first time, I saw it in her face, not anger. Calculation. She realized I wasn't bluffing. You would actually let the authorities get involved? She asked. Yes. Her breath caught slightly. She's pregnant, she said suddenly. The sentence landed between us, heavy and strategic. I didn't react immediately. Is she? I asked. Yes, my mother replied. A criminal investigation will follow her forever. You'll ruin your niece or nephew's life before it begins. There it was. Emotional leverage. Future projection. Inherited guilt. I studied her face carefully. You didn't think about future consequences when you handed over my security answers, I said softly. Silence stretched. She had no response for that. You chose Savannah, I continued. You made that clear long ago. You just never expected me to choose myself. Time slice. Her shoulders dropped slightly, then not in defeat, but in recognition. You're tearing this family apart, she whispered. I shook my head gently. It was already broken. She stood there a moment longer, as if waiting for me to soften. I didn't. Finally, she turned toward the door. Think carefully, she said before leaving. There's no undoing this. After she left, I locked the door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. She was right about one thing. There was no undoing this. But not because I had filed reports. Because they had crossed a line that erased the possibility of trust. 2 days later, final notices were sent. Documentation was delivered. Escalations were confirmed. The trap wasn't loud. It was structured. And by the time the wedding weekend arrived, the system they thought they had manipulated was already turning. They still believed I might back down. They still believed emotion would override evidence. They still believed I would prioritize their comfort over my stability. They had underestimated something fundamental. The daughter who signed papers without reading them at 22 was gone. And in her place stood someone who understood exactly how systems collapse when built on fraud. The wedding day would be their celebration. But it would also be the moment reality surfaced. And this time, I wasn't walking into it blind. The morning of the wedding arrived unnaturally calm. There was no dramatic thunderstorm, no cinematic sign from the sky that something was about to fracture. The sun rose over the coast in soft gold light, exactly the way Savannah had envisioned it when she described the ceremony months ago. Ocean backdrop, white chairs, imported florals, champagne towers, perfection. I woke early, not because I was anxious, but because my body had already adjusted to operating under pressure. I made coffee. I checked my phone. No new messages overnight, at least not from numbers I hadn't already muted. The fraud investigation had officially progressed to escalation status. The lending institution had flagged the loan as disputed. Internal review had begun. Law enforcement had been notified, though formal interviews would come later. The machine was already moving. And they had no idea. Savannah had sent me the live stream link weeks earlier, back when she assumed I would be watching with quiet pride or maybe even guilt. The irony wasn't lost on me now. Family only. I opened the link just before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The video quality was high definition, professionally streamed. Guests filtered into their seats. I recognized a few distant relatives, former classmates, people who likely believed the narrative of the resilient bride and her ambitious fiancé. Savannah appeared on screen shortly after, radiant in a gown that probably cost more than my first car. Her makeup was flawless, her smile practiced but convincing. She looked like someone stepping into a curated future. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to see her as she might have been hopeful, excited, convinced she deserved this day. Then I remembered the video of her practicing my signature, the email from my mother, the laughter. My phone buzzed softly beside me. Jordan. Account still frozen. Any trigger from your side? Not yet, I typed back. The largest payment for the venue had been scheduled to finalize shortly before the ceremony concluded. It was structured in phases: deposit, interim, final balance. The final balance was substantial, and it was linked to the same financial architecture that had been flagged under investigation. I wasn't acting out of revenge. I was allowing due process to intersect with timing. The officiant began speaking. Waves rolled gently behind the altar. Guests leaned forward in admiration. Savannah walked down the aisle with confidence that bordered on triumph. Somewhere inside me, there was still a flicker of something human, something that recognized how public collapse would feel. But then I remembered something else. They hadn't hesitated, not when they planned to sell my car, not when they rehearsed my signature, not when they submitted a $500,000 loan under my identity. Hesitation had never been part of their strategy. So I didn't hesitate either. As the vows approached, I opened my laptop and reviewed the final confirmation from the bank's fraud department. They had scheduled automatic flags for any transaction tied to the disputed loan's associated accounts. If the venue attempted to process final settlement through those linked funds or connected credit lines, it would trigger a hold. I didn't need to press anything dramatic. I simply authorized the final documentation release from my side, confirming full cooperation with the investigation and affirming that any disputed charges under review were unauthorized. It was a quiet action, but timing is rarely quiet. On screen, Savannah and Derek reached the part of the ceremony where the officiant asked if anyone objected. No one spoke. The ocean breeze lifted her veil gently. And then I saw it. Movement from the side of the frame. The resort's event manager, polished, composed, but visibly tense, approached the altar area with a tablet in hand. The officiant paused mid-sentence. The music faltered slightly. Savannah's smile flickered. The camera zoomed out slightly, capturing confusion rippling through the guests. The manager leaned toward Derek first, whispering urgently. Derek's face shifted almost instantly, confidence draining into something sharper. He stepped away from the altar. Savannah tried to maintain composure, but her eyes darted. Even without sound, I could read it. Payment declined. Account under review. Immediate settlement required. The livestream microphone picked up fragments as Derek's voice rose slightly. There must be a mistake. The manager shook his head. professional but firm. Final balance of $60,000 must be resolved immediately. The primary card has been flagged. Flagged. I watched Savannah's face carefully. At first, disbelief. Then, panic. Guests began whispering. Some stood. The music cut entirely. It wasn't chaos. It was unraveling. My phone began vibrating almost immediately. Savannah. Declined. My mother. Declined. Savannah again. This time, I answered. Her voice hit my ear like a storm. "What did you do?" she demanded, not crying yet, but teetering. "I reported fraud," I replied calmly. "You're ruining my wedding," she screamed. "No," I said evenly. "You built it on stolen ground." There was a pause on the line, brief, sharp. "You can fix this," she said, her tone shifting from fury to urgency. "Just unflag the accounts. We'll deal with everything later." Later. Temporary. Familiar words. "I can't undo an investigation," I said. "And I won't." Her breathing quickened. "Do you know how humiliating this is?" she whispered. Yes, I did. Because I had lived quiet humiliation for years. "I warned you," I said softly. The line went silent for a second. Then she screamed something indistinct and hung up. I placed the phone back on the table and returned my eyes to the screen. Derek was arguing with the manager now, gesturing toward guests, toward the ocean, toward the unfinished vows. Savannah stood rigid, bouquet still in hand, her perfect day paused mid-script. The live stream abruptly cut to a holding screen. And just like that, the illusion ended. My phone continued buzzing voicemail after voicemail. My mother's messages escalated from outrage to desperation. "You've destroyed everything. You've embarrassed us. Call me immediately." My father's name appeared once. He left no voicemail. For a moment, I sat very still, not triumphant, not gloating, just steady. For years, I had been the quiet stabilizer of their chaos, the invisible financier behind their comfort. They had assumed that role was permanent. But systems built on exploitation don't collapse loudly. They collapse when the exploited withdraw. I closed my laptop slowly. The ocean on the screen disappeared. The room returned to silence. Outside my apartment window, the city moved, normally cars passing, pedestrians walking, life continuing. Inside, something had ended. Not the investigation. Not the legal process. The illusion. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't scrambling to absorb consequences for someone else's choices. I wasn't transferring funds. I wasn't apologizing. I wasn't bending. I was simply allowing the truth to surface at the exact moment they believed they had won. And as my phone continued vibrating with missed calls, I realized something unexpectedly light. I didn't feel empty. I felt free. If there's one thing this story taught me, it's that betrayal doesn't always arrive in one explosive moment. Sometimes it builds slowly, disguised as family obligation, temporary help, or "you're strong enough to handle it." The most dangerous kind of exploitation is the one wrapped in love, because it convinces you that setting boundaries is selfish. But here's the truth. Protecting yourself is not cruelty. Saying no to manipulation is not betrayal. And refusing to finance someone else's irresponsibility is not jealousy, it's self-respect. This video wasn't just about a wedding collapsing. It was about a woman finally recognizing her worth beyond what she could provide. It was about the moment when silence stops being grace and starts being damage. And most importantly, it was about choosing dignity over guilt. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the strong one, the dependable one, the invisible engine holding everything together, I hope it reminded you that you're allowed to step back. You're allowed to protect your future. For more stories about truth, justice, resilience, and emotional strength, subscribe to Revenge Tale Network. Your support keeps these powerful stories alive. And now I want to hear from you. Would you have done the same?